We're all very human and fallible, and yet we live in a society that rewards pretending we're not fallible, or the range of acceptable fallibility is narrow.
We are constantly comparing our insides to other people's outsides and feeling inadequate and guilty, even ashamed.
Trying to blend in means parts of ourselves must disappear, and we must then live in fear that we will be found out.
Here, together, we will create a space where we can laugh, cry, and carry our suffering and hurts lightly.
In the service of being deeply human.
This is Life's Dirty Little Secrets. Hello. Welcome to Life's Dirty Little Secrets. I'm Chris McCurry.
And I'm Emma Waddington. And today I'm so excited to have Becky Platt with me, who's actually a colleague of Anna, my sister, who was on our, just over a year ago now. And Becky is actually with me here in Singapore, which is very exciting. This is only the second time we've had somebody in the same country. Actually, no, we've done in the US, but never in Singapore before. So this is a first. So Becky's here to talk to us today, and she's a pediatric nurse with over 20 years experience. And the reason why she's here today is because of her passion for putting the patient at the center of what we do. And she has done some incredible humanitarian work, having just recently come back from Gaza as part of her work for Save the Children. She's got a beautiful TEDx talk, which we will be putting in our show notes. And she also has a lovely not-for-profit organization that's called Don't Forget the Bubbles. And I thought you could talk a little bit about that, Becky. And yes, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and excited to be in Singapore. Yes, thank you. Don't Forget the Bubbles is a non-profit organization that I'm on the exec team for. And we provide education for anyone who needs to look after sick children. So we've got lots of resources, including a conference, a website, a podcast. And we also, in addition to the education, what we aim to do is build a community of practice where people feel connected and safe and supported in what they do.
Sounds beautiful. We'll be putting that in our show notes as well. Sounds really important work, actually. Thank you, Becky. And thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So I watched your TEDx talk today, and it moved me to tears. It was very sweet, very moving, very passionate, and made me very excited to be able to actually, talk to you about the important work that you do. And, what I took from the talk, and I would encourage all our listeners to watch it, is you talked about this difficult work that you do in pediatric emergency care, trauma care, crazy busy situations. And you talk about what we might call a secret ingredient or element in making the connections that you have with your patients stronger and more vital and more effective in the work that you do. And that boils down to compassion and even love in those crazy moments of, high-tech emergency room, saving people's lives. Though I, believe that it could extend to other situations too that involve two human beings in a situation that's stressful, and people are looking for a way of making that kind of connection. So tell us about that work that you do and how compassion and love are such an important part of it.
Yeah, I think the reason that I've been able to stay in this work for a quarter of a century now is because I truly value the connection that I get with other human beings. I think that there's this misconception amongst some healthcare professionals that in order to be professional, there has to be this degree of separation between me as the person in charge and you as the person receiving the care or the advice that I'm going to give you. but actually it's about making a connection human to human that really matters. And I think much as people do need, advice and sometimes life-saving treatment, actually what they need is to feel seen and heard and connected on a human level. And that's actually the bit that makes the difference.
Well, in those stressful situations, I think that kind of connection can go out the window as an almost a self-protective move. Like I can't get too close to this person. They might die any minute now, or I'm feeling incredibly responsible, so I have to get into my high efficiency technical mode. And I suppose those aspects of your job, or a lot of jobs, are necessary but not sufficient.
Yeah, I think that there needs to be balance, doesn't there? Sometimes we are in incredibly difficult, challenging situations where we need to deliver, highly technical care at very fast, very high speed in order for it to be effective and life-saving. But I think what we've got to remember is that actually there's a person on the receiving end of that. And that's why we're doing it. And I think sometimes in the moment, we need to be professional and slightly removed enough in order to be able to think clearly. But it can't just be a task, and it can't be, I've got to get this chest drain in, or I've got to do whatever. It has to be about the person. And I think even in life and death situations, we've got to remember that it's about the person and their family, not about interventions and success or failure of interventions. It's actually about the person.
When I think of those moments in the emergency room where you are with somebody whose life is very much at risk, I can see how being in that fight, flight, sort of almost freeze, potentially, emotional experience would sort of pull us to disconnecting from this being a human, because emotionally, it must be very hard to think that somebody might die in your hands.
Yeah, I mean, that is the worst thing that can happen, clearly. Although, sometimes there is something about providing and facilitating a good death. But I think often when we see professionals very disconnected in those moments, we hear things like, he's trying to die on us. Or, he's circling the drain. Let's, give it everything we've got. And I think those things are incredibly dehumanizing. And actually then it becomes a tension between what we as the professionals are trying to do. We're trying to save this person's life and they are trying to die. And in my experience, nobody in that situation is trying to die. Actually, what they're doing is trying to live, and they're holding on with everything they've got. And what we should be doing as healthcare professionals and humans is pulling together and feeling like we're pulling together with our patient, and we're all trying our very hardest for that person to pull through and to survive. It shouldn't be this competition between us about, us winning when we've saved a life. Actually, it was a joint endeavor and we got there together.
That's really interesting. So that process of suddenly dehumanizing, like you said, the patient, where they're dying, they're trying to die on us, that competitive piece that you described is astonishing, I guess, because I've thankfully never had to be in that situation. But is there a part of the medical professional in that moment that feels inadequate, and that's what they're up against, this feeling of the fear?
I think
What's
it's
happening
probably
there?
I think it's fear related. I think that we sometimes feel responsible. We feel that we should be able to control things that we can't control. We feel that we should be able to prevent death at all costs. And that's not how it is. That's, inevitably some people will die because infection is overwhelming, or they were born with a condition that was unsurvivable, or their injuries are not survivable. That's not about our inadequacy. That's about nature and the pattern of life.
Yeah. And I guess that's the part that is really difficult for some people to accept, that we have to accept our fallibility, or that the context is so strong that we can't influence.
Yeah.
Be it the health context or whichever context. And I guess making room for that, those experiences and those feelings is huge. It must be very challenging in those moments, like to accept that this may not be something that we can control.
I think then we've got to learn to recognize when it's time.
Yeah.
And then to switch into making death comfortable and the best it can possibly be. A story's just come to mind about a situation that happened when I was in Gaza that feels relevant. Can I tell you that story?
Yeah.
I was working in a field hospital, and we would get children brought in after various injuries and sometimes illnesses and so on, because there was a huge camp of displaced people right on the doorstep. And this young person got brought in by his family, and he had multiple complex needs, even, dating back years. He'd been a victim of a shooting, an explosion several years ago, and he had multiple needs associated with that. But on the day that I met him, he was suffering from overwhelming sepsis. He was incredibly unwell. And initially we started all of the treatment that we could. We started getting IV lines in, and we were thinking about giving him antibiotics and fluids. But it was rapidly very obvious that although he may survive today or tomorrow, he was not going to survive probably beyond that. And to put him through multiple attempts at IV cannulation and so on would be, frankly, inhumane, incredibly painful. And so much as the team needed to save lives in that situation because of all the devastation going on around us, we recognized that this was not one that we could save. And we spent time talking to his family, and we agreed that what we would do is make life, the end of his life, as comfortable as it could be. And so we managed to get a message out into the camp to get his family and close friends with him. We made him as comfortable as we could with what little pain relief we had available at the time. And we gave him as much privacy as we could, and he passed away a couple of hours later. And that felt like, although he hadn't survived, it felt like a huge achievement that we'd got it right for him, even though we hadn't gone for heroics and tried the life-saving treatment.
I didn't know I'd need tissues. That's all right. It's just so, I think Chris has tissues a bit far. I should have come prepared. I don't think I've ever felt tearful on one of our podcasts. I think let me compose myself.
Sorry, I should have come with a trigger warning.
Yeah, it's just, it's so moving. But I think it's such a difficult, such a courageous and bold decision to make as a clinician, as a team. And I don't know how we help. And I think that's what you're here to talk about. And that's what, your work is all about, is helping people think about, yes, the individual, the human at the center. And you thought about this boy and what the most compassionate act would be for him and his family, and how that was more important than at that moment doing everything you could, given what you knew about his care and his condition, to save him. And it just feels incredibly brave and very difficult.
You also mentioned in your TED Talk that this kind of compassion is a gift to the person who is offering the compassion. I mean, it is an antidote to burnout and a way of seeing a bigger picture in what we're doing, whether it's, the kind of intense, technical work that you so often do, or probably just, a parent trying to get their child out of the house to get to school in the morning when things aren't going particularly smoothly. That having that compassionate stance allows us to be our best self, even if that is not the self that we would like to be at the moment. We want to be strong and competent and take care of everything and be in control, and sometimes we just can't.
Yeah, I think often it's easier for us to do more and to do more and more, even when we can see it's not making a difference in healthcare. And actually, the braver thing often is to say, enough, let's change tack, let's provide comfort, let's be compassionate, rather than continuously trying more and more invasive things. And I actually, it was a difficult day that day because, we had gone there to save lives, but actually it felt like we'd done the right thing. And I came away feeling like actually we'd had a good day because we'd done the right thing and we'd given this young man the best death that he could have had under the circumstances.
Yeah, I was thinking something else you said in your TED Talk. I'm just going to do your TED Talk right here. That you talked about our stories collide and we share a chapter together. It may be brief and intense, but it's a bridge between before and after. And I think that story you just told illustrates that very nicely, where, his story, your story, everybody's, it collided in that moment, those hours. And it was intense. It was brief. And you created that bridge, allowing him to move on from this life to hopefully something better. I don't know. Can't speculate. But yeah, that you shared a chapter together. I thought that was a very powerful way to think about these interactions that we have with others.
Yeah, I love this idea. And it's something that I think about a lot because I think it works with our patients, but it also works with our, friends and other acquaintances as well. There are some people that are in our lives a very long time, and hopefully that's our family and it will be our good friends as well. And we walk a part of our journey together and we shape each other along the way, and we're both changed because of it. But there are other people, and often patients come into that category where we just share a tiny moment together. And sometimes it could be a few minutes, and sometimes it could be a few hours, and sometimes it could be days or weeks or months. But each one of those interactions has the power to change us and them. And I love that there are these touch points that can do that. However brief, they can be deeply meaningful.
Yes. That reminds me of the conversation we had with Karina about interpersonal violence. And she mentioned that even though you have these brief moments with the young people, and she was talking about working in violence in a trauma center, but not to underestimate the impact that interaction can have. And I think listening to you talk about, caring for the person, not just the person's body. And I think about, the work that Chris and I do. And, as parents, as humans, we can get so caught up in the detail of what needs to get done right now. And like you said, we can keep doing more and more and more and more. And I think of that in life in general. We can always do more. And at the moment, it feels like everybody's telling us to do more. We can lose touch with, the humans in our life, those little moments of connection, even connecting with somebody that you're ordering a coffee from or somebody that is giving you the groceries. I mean, we know that the research shows that if we're thinking about loneliness being, this epidemic that we have at the moment, that we're all feeling really lonely, it is those small micro connections during the day that make the difference. It's not, the family gathering that happens once a year. It's not the, dinner dates, although those help, I'm sure, because they happen more frequently. But it's the little conversations during the day that you can catch. And unfortunately, we're having less and less of those. But that human touch, be it with your GP, be it with your hairdresser, be it with the person at the shop, at the cashier, really do nurture us.
You reminded me of those with those brief interactions, and also Chris talking about this idea of compassion as a gift for both. I remember shortly after, actually that's not true, I'll start that bit again. I remember being in the corridor at work just outside the resus room, and a mother was pacing up and down holding a small baby, and she looked utterly distraught, and I asked her if she needed some help, and she could obviously tell that I was a nurse. I was in my uniform, and she said, "My dad's dying in resus and I need to go and say goodbye to him, but I don't want to take my baby in there." So I said, "Look, I'll hold the baby. You go and say goodbye to your dad." And she said, "Oh, I don't want to take up your time." I said, "Look, take as long as you need. I'll just stand here holding the baby until you come back." And I was thinking about, the fact that my own dad had died several years before, and reflecting on that as I was cuddling this lovely baby. And when she came out, her dad had died while she was in the room. And she said to me, "Thank you for allowing me to be there. I just don't know how I'm going to go on. How will I ever get over this? Have you ever lost anyone that you love?" And I said, "Well, actually, I've lost my dad as well. And in my experience, you don't get over this, but you do learn to live with it." And she gave me a hug. I gave the baby back, and we just went our separate ways. But I realized afterwards that the gift that she had given me was that I had actually understood that I had found a way to learn to live with the fact that my dad wasn't around anymore. And that was a huge gift for me. And I literally met her for minutes.
So moving. What a generous gesture, actually. I mean, it seems so simple, and yet I can see how you could have seen this person and then thought, actually, I need to go and do something else, right? There could have been something on your to-do list that felt really important, or, maybe you had something else on your mind where you didn't have room for that mother. And that can, there's so many ways that moment could have not happened.
Yeah, I know. I feel it's amazing, isn't it? How, life presents us with these multiple opportunities, and we just have to kind of learn to take them.
Yes. Yes. And be open to them. I think if I imagine you having had the loss of your father, did you know that he was in the room? There was a man in the resuscitation room at the time?
I didn't know what was going on.
Wow. Yeah. So even more, in a way, that for you had to be willing to sit with difficult feelings, because I suspect you knew that it wasn't an easy situation the woman was in, that you had to be willing to sit with whatever was going to show up in the service of helping her.
Yeah. I think I kind of probably didn't even think that far ahead in the moment, but I'm so glad that I did do that, because she desperately needed to say goodbye to her dad. She didn't want baby involved in that situation. It needed to be her time with him and him alone. And I never would have been able to give her that gift or receive what I did if I rushed on by. So thank goodness I didn't.
Yeah. Yes.
A number of years ago, I attended a lecture by a very famous psychologist from California. And she travels a lot, gives a lot of lectures. And she talked about coming back from some, business trip that she'd done. And she had a son at the time. And she thought, okay, I'm really going to spend some quality time with my son. And she had this day plan where they were going to go to the beach and they were going to do all this stuff. And, so she's getting the car packed and she's, getting him going and stuff. And he's standing outside their house and he's looking at the ground and she's saying, come on, let's go. We're going to get to the beach. We're going to do this and do that. He's looking at the ground and she comes over and he's looking at some bugs that are on the ground. And she looked at him, she looked at the bugs, she looked at the car, and she sat down on the ground with him, and they spent like 40 minutes looking at bugs. And the beach and all the plans and the agenda and all that stuff could just wait. And she said she was grateful that she was able to recognize that moment and be, what in the work that Emma and I do, the kind of therapy that we do, we talk a lot about context sensitivity, and not just be so driven by our rules or our to-do list or whatever, that we can be open to the possibilities in, here and now and what's going on and how to respond to that in a way that works for her and for her child, for whomever you're dealing with. But I will always remember that story.
Yes.
What great parenting that she could just respond to his needs in that moment.
Yeah, and she described it was a struggle because it was like, she had this thing that it was all planned out. And she was like, this is going to be a great day and I'm going to make up for my time being away by giving him this fabulous day, when what he really wanted was to sit on the ground and look at bugs.
I love that.
Yes. Yes. And I think what that points to as well is this letting go of our ego, of, what will help us feel masterful, right, in that moment. And that, sometimes we think that what needs to happen is to save a life, is to get our kids to, this fantastic day, is to finish everything in our to-do list, whatever it might be that our mind's telling us is the most important thing. And letting go of that and actually dropping into the moment can be very difficult. We can get really stuck with these rules about what's the right thing looks like in this moment. And I think especially if there are some big feelings that come along with it, like guilt when we're a parent, right? Guilt seems to be always ever present in my experience as a parent. The sense of never doing enough, never being present enough, never fun enough.
They don't let you leave the hospital these days without, an appropriate car seat for your child and a bag of guilt. So here's your car seat. Here's your guilt. Enjoy parenting.
That's right. That's right.
I often find myself saying that to parents at work, especially parents of newborns, that they're feeling guilty about something, the baby's not warm enough, the baby hasn't got the right clothes on. Maybe they had to give a formula feed because the baby couldn't get on the breast, or, heaven forbid, the baby had a little accident or something like that. And I often say, in my experience as a parent, you will always find something to feel guilty about. So maybe just try to also remember the amazing things that you are doing for your baby right now.
Yes. And so I think that when we are sort of caught up with these big feelings, we're going to be desperately trying to reduce them. So if it's, parental guilt, or if we're feeling inadequate, like that's back to the beginning of our conversation with, doctors feeling this sort of urgency to save someone's life, of understandably that's something that a rule that could easily dominate in that moment, versus being able to lean into the human. And you said something very important, which was being able to lean into that human connection is what's kept you going so long.
Yeah.
So I'd love to touch on that, because I think thinking back to our conversation with my sister and thinking back to conversations we've had on burnout, you're doing really difficult work. And I think as parents, we do, pretty difficult work, and that how this has protected you and kept you going for as
Because
long
it is kind of counterintuitive. One would think that I have to protect myself in order to not get burned out. So I can't allow that stuff in, when in fact, that's how we, or at least maybe for some people that doesn't work, but at least give it a try to see if that doesn't in fact leaven what we're doing a little bit and make it deeper and richer and more rewarding. But please, Becky, please riff off what Emma just said.
Yeah, I think because as we get busier and busier in healthcare and in life, probably, we have this kind of habit of dehumanizing things. And in healthcare, that's often just small comments like, the fractured femur in 3, the abdo pain in 4, things like that. And I think it's just a shorthand for remembering where they are and what's wrong with them. It's not, are not the sum total of their diagnosis or potential diagnosis. They were a whole person before they entered the hospital. You're walking this small chapter together, and then there'll be a whole person again afterwards, hopefully. They are not the abdo pain in 4. So I think, one of the things that we can do is to try to use names and remember something about these people that we meet that is meaningful above and beyond what's wrong with them. And I think that, that happens, that works also outside of the hospital. You talked about building small connections with, the person that you meet at the supermarket, or, somebody that you buy your coffee from, so that they are not, the supermarket cashier or, the barista. Maybe just make a tiny connection, make a comment about the weather or something. It makes them into a human. And I think there's a whole lot of dehumanizing and a whole lot of othering going on at the moment, which makes it so easy for us to disconnect with the difficult stuff that's going on in the world and not to feel it in the way that we should be feeling it. If you bring it back to one person, all of a sudden becomes more meaningful. And I remember when I was sharing stories after I came home from Gaza most recently and other humanitarian missions, that actually when you remind people about one person's story, that's when they feel it. So we've got to try to remember that these are humans at the end of this story, not numbers.
And for me, it's obvious why. Why is it so important not to lose that, do you think, for you? What's really important about not forgetting that one person, making everybody numbers and disconnecting from the human behind that number?
For me, the whole point of being a human is connecting with other humans and feeling emotion, sharing experiences, even recognizing that we can share the same experience and experience it 2 entirely different ways, or feel 2 entirely different things as a result of it, and understanding that we are still together in this. We've still got this shared human experience. That's how we make meaning of lives. That's surely the whole point of being here.
Yeah. And I think that just thinking about all the experiences that you've recently had, with going to Gaza and well, actually across your clinical sort of life, there's been all these opportunities that you could have just seen a number and a statistic, and you've chosen to see the human. And that has kept you feeling very alive and very committed and engaged in the work that you do and finding great meaning in the work that you do. And like Chris said, it's often people think that the only way to survive, and I'll put that in air quotes, the work that you do is by disconnecting emotionally because it's such painful work. But actually, the opposite is true. It's finding meaning in those interactions so that, in a way, that's the priority. It's the human that's the priority versus whether they'll live or not, or whether I can stop this war or not. It's continuing to focus on the things you can control, because that interaction you can control. You can make that moment a connected moment with that individual versus, can I make the situation better in terms of, obviously with some of the work that you've done with Save the Children or with some of your patients, some of those parts are out of your control, but perhaps that connection part isn't.
Yeah, I think the connection is everything. And, I think often, for example, in my work in London, we often see young people coming in who've been victims of stabbing or other interpersonal violence. And there is sometimes an assumption amongst healthcare and, police and other organizations that, they're just, they're gang members. It was bound to happen at some stage, or, that there's judgment around that. And I think we have to remember that there are vulnerable children, human beings at the end of this. And actually, we're more alike than we're different. And I often think, I'm lucky, my teenage children are at home, or maybe not at home, but somewhere safe. And they're not victims of this level of violence. This person in front of me is somebody else's son or daughter, and they're not loved any less because of what they may or may not be involved with. It's not for me to judge that. One of my colleagues on Don't Forget the Bubbles, Henry, always has this lovely turn of phrase about everything in general. But one of the things that he says is, people come to us for health care, not health judgment. And I think that is incredibly important to hold on to.
Wow. Yes. I want to live in that world. I want to live in the world where we let go of judgment and we create more bridges. And I think it is possible, one Becky at a time, but I do see how hard it is as humans. We've had many conversations on the podcast about, our nature is to see ourselves as tribes, as to see ourselves as different, us and them, and how much pain that creates. And even though that is a human default, so we were born into because of the world that we evolved from. Well, we haven't evolved from quite yet, actually. We're still working on the evolution part. We're still living with a brain that, came into action when we were incredibly threatened. And so we're very good at finding threat in others. And I think what we want to be looking at is through your lens, where it's not so much about difference, but what do we share? Because the world can be a better place when you're looking at what we have in common with, especially somebody else who's suffering. And I think about the young people that, my sister talks about, and I've got two boys, and I think, they're suffering. those young people are suffering and have a lot of challenges ahead of them. And they need our compassion and our support more than our judgment. But we judge when we see difference. And we had a great conversation. Actually, it's reminding me of the one we had with Amy Beddoes about victim blame. And it was very powerful that, we all feel better when we blame a victim than when we start to recognize that we fall into those patterns and that victims are victims. And it feels so uncomfortable to see victims as victims because we want to find out how to keep ourselves safe. And by blaming a victim, we feel safer ourselves. But the bottom line, I think, what I'm saying in a very long, convoluted way is I want to live in a world where we're not so black and white. We're not so tribal. We are freer of judgment. We're braver to see connection. And in the ways that you've described.
All right. Any final thought?
I think I'd just like Becky to talk very briefly, because I know we're running out of time, about, the loving your patient. Because we haven't really touched on that as deeply as...
Oh, yes.
Yes, I love that. And I think that is very new and radical, air quotes again. So go ahead. Talk a little bit about why is it important to love your patient? And it feels, it's a perspective that, as psychologists, I think we can recognize, but I don't think it's talked about much in the medical field.
I think it's interesting, and I reflected on this a lot. I think there are many different types of love, and probably I think the Greeks had a better way of describing love than we do, and they have lots of different words for it. But we just use this one word that's in many ways inadequate. And I think we tend to think of love as something that's either romantic or something that we can only associate with people in our family or our very close friendship group. But actually, if you think about love as connection rather than anything else, it's easier to understand how we might be able to love our patients. And I think sometimes that just means a deep sense of care and connection and compassion rather than anything that's romantic or that might be reserved for our family. I once told a young man in resus that I loved him because that was what he needed to hear in that moment. He thought that he was dying. He needed to feel love. And in that moment, I think I felt so much connection and compassion, and just my heart was so kind of full for him that I told him I loved him, and it wasn't a lie.
Beautiful. And wow, I'm just so touched again by that. I can just imagine how much that mattered to that young man. And I think about it with our clients sometimes that, they've been devoid of real love and they haven't felt. And it's not just, we're talking about this client, but I'm thinking in the world in general, how many of us are feeling lonely and disconnected? It's a huge problem we face, a huge problem. And just to think that we can walk around thinking of how to help someone feel more loved and respected and cared for in this moment feels really precious and beautiful.
I think it's something about, I see you, I value you, and I respect you, and I can feel for you. I want to be connected with you, even if it's only for a moment. You matter to me as a fellow human being. Long that lasts. And that is a form of love for other humans. So it's not wrong to feel that for our patients or our clients. Somebody else that we've shared a moment with in the course of our daily lives. That's part of the human condition.
Yes. And absolutely. I mean, it makes complete sense. How could it not be? Right? How could it not be? And I think when we train, and I imagine it's similar in the medical field, there's a lot of conversations about, obviously, romantic love is absolutely off. But how to create that, we call it the therapeutic alliance, and how time after time, studies after studies, that is the biggest piece that influences change in therapy. And if we think at the sort of outcomes of long-lasting, loving relationships, it's the friendship and feeling really seen and understood by your partner. And if we think of the impact of parenting, it's that sort of secure bond. So how could it be different with the rest of the human connections? That really it's that being seen really matters. And the more we can gift our community with that, be it in any relationship or any interaction, I think the better the world can be. And we can combat almost, this serious problem we have with loneliness and disconnection and, even in politics. And there is this taking sides that goes against this. Well, it doesn't go against, but it gets in the way of our ability to connect with the humans in either side. And I think I talk about often on the podcast and often with my couples, Jedi skills. Some of these Jedi skills as humans is our ability to see beyond the difference, beyond what we don't agree with. Some of these incredible humans that have sort of walked the planet have been able to do that, not to get caught up on the difference.
I love the term Jedi skills. I think I might steal that.
Take it if it's useful. Yeah, if my couples are ever listening to the podcast, they'll recognize that. Because I think it is hard. It's not easy. It's not easy for us to look over different, somebody having a different perspective to us. Like if I think about when I'm having an argument, that's what I'm looking at, that you don't agree with me and you are wrong. I'm right.
How could you think that?
Yeah, I love being right. It's one of my favorite pastimes. Oh, yeah. And so being able to sort of sit back and take a moment to actually listen to what this other person is saying is a Jedi skill because, I'd like to gallop on the righteous horse much more than sit back and be humble and risk being wrong.
I hate being humble.
That lovely saying, isn't there? I don't know where it came from. If you have to make a choice between being right and being kind, choose kind.
Yeah. I think that's what Chris, you've shared that one before.
Well, it was a friend of mine in graduate school whose two children were fighting, and a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old. And she was about to break it up when she heard the 7-year-old girl say to the 9-year-old boy, "Do you want to be right or do you want it to work out?"
Oh, I love that.
I know. How smart.
And my answer is like, well, both,
Both.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I want it to work out because I'm right, but we can't always have both.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we can be right or we can be kind. We can be right or we can have it work out.
Yes. And it's so seductive, the wanting to be right.
Yeah.
Oh man. Yeah. I'm still working on that Jedi skill.
I think we all are. I think that the trick is recognizing that we're still working on it.
Yeah. It's a work in progress.
100%. 100%.
Righteousness in recovery.
Righteousness in recovery. Oh, yes.
Love that.
That's brilliant. I think I might just put that up somewhere in my household. I think there's a lot of that going on. Well, thank you, Becky. I think I could have another hour at least.
Well, ditto. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
It's just, I wish I had the tissues because I felt there's some, I was holding back, but your stories are very touching. And I feel privileged to have had your time, but I think the world is better with you in it. Honestly, I think, yeah, incredible work.
That's very kind. Thank you so much.
Yes. And really thank you for this chapter of ours together.
Yes.
As our lives have collided and we move beyond, better for it.
Yes.
So, I encourage everyone to check out the show notes and see listen to your TED Talk and check out Don't Forget the Bubbles and Save the Children.
Beautiful.
All right. So, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning into the Life's Dirty Little Secrets podcast.
If you have any feedback for us or secrets for future episodes, you can email us at lifesdirtylittlesecretspodcast@gmail.com.
Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Life's Dirty Little Secrets or on Facebook at Life's Dirty Little Secrets Podcast.
We invite you to follow, rate, and review us on wherever you listen to this podcast. It is the best way to get our podcast out in front of new listeners.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks with more.
See you then.